It wasn't the atomic bomb that broke Japan. It was something far older and far more human. An island that screamed, an army that learned to breathe fire, and a generation of soldiers who discovered that victory could look exactly like hell. In the spring of 1945, the island of Okinawa became the final doorway to Japan, and the last place on Earth anyone wanted to die. Beneath its white cliffs and coral dust, engineers had built a fortress that didn't just resist invasion, it swallowed it whole. For 80 days, the world's most powerful armies unleashed storms of steel, flame, and invention. Every gunshot was a question. How far would humanity go to win? This isn't just the story of a battle. It's the moment war learned to think, and when fire became the only language left to speak. Before we descend into the fires of Okinawa, take a second to hit like, subscribe, and share if you love deep dive documentaries that go beyond the headlines. It really helps keep this channel alive and independent. Now, settle in, turn up your sound, and let's step into the island where technology met terror and humanity itself began to change. Okinawa wasn't just another island on a map. It was the final stepping stone to Japan, the last gate before the homeland itself. By 1945, the Pacific had already become a graveyard of coral and steel. But this place was different. It wasn't lush like the jungles of Guadalcanal or volcanic like Iwo Jima. It was carved from limestone, white, sharp, ancient. A land that looked like it had already been through one apocalypse and was quietly preparing for another. Beneath its calm surface, tunnels whispered. The Japanese had been digging for months, turning the island into a living labyrinth. Above, farmers still tended their fields. Below, soldiers waited in the dark, listening for engines that would signal the end of the world. When the Americans landed on April 1st, the beaches were silent. Too silent. Veterans from Saipan and Tarawa expected machine gun fire, mortars, chaos. But instead, the only sound was the sea. Some joked that Japan had finally run out of soldiers. Others just stared at the cliffs, uneasy. They didn't know it yet, but the island itself was studying them. Deep underground, General Mitsuru Ushijima watched from his command post inside Shuri Castle, surrounded by maps drawn in candlelight. He had no intention of defending the beaches. He wanted the Americans to come inland, to step willingly into his trap. Every path, every ridge, every cave mouth had been measured, fortified, and marked for death. For the first few days, Okinawa almost felt like a lie. The Americans advanced with ease, capturing airfields, villages, and crossroads with barely a fight. Newspapers back home called it the softest landing of the war. But on the 7th day, the ground changed its mind. A single artillery shell screamed out of the hills, followed by hundreds more. The silence that had lulled the soldiers into relief shattered into thunder. From the limestone cliffs, machine guns woke up, and the island began to breathe. Men dropped where they stood. Craters bloomed like open mouths. The earth itself seemed to pulse, alive, angry, and unwilling to let go. From that moment on, Okinawa stopped being geography. It became an organism. Every cave had eyes, every hill had a heartbeat, and every soldier who stepped forward was swallowed by a war that no longer followed rules or reason. The Americans thought they were landing on an island. What they had really stepped onto was a lesson. One carved in stone, waiting patiently for humanity to arrive and test how far it could go before it broke itself. Long before the first American boot touched Okinawan soil, the island had already been turned inside out. Beneath its quiet villages and terraced hills lay a second world, one carved not by nature, but by desperation. Japanese engineers, soldiers, and even civilians had spent months tunneling into the limestone, turning the ground itself into armor. There were hospitals without daylight, command rooms that smelled of oil and sweat, shrines hidden behind sandbags. Wires ran through the rock like veins. Oxygen pipes hissed softly in the dark. It wasn't just defense, it was transformation. Okinawa was no longer a piece of land. It was a living fortress with lungs of concrete and bones of stone. Inside this underground empire, General Mitsuru Ushijima and his strategist, General Isamu Cho, built something the world had never seen before. A defense designed not to win, but to endure. Their logic was brutal. Japan could not stop America's firepower, but it could make every inch of ground cost blood. The tunnels were arranged like organs of a single body. Artillery nests connected to sniper holes, command posts linked to mortar pits. If one was destroyed, another would awaken. The idea was simple and merciless. The island itself would fight. And it would never stop breathing until every man above it had drowned in exhaustion. Up above, American bombers and naval guns roared day and night, shaking the cliffs until they glowed red from heat. But when the smoke cleared, the bunkers still stood. Marines called it hell made of limestone. Shells sank into the ground and vanished, explosions echoing through corridors that refused to collapse. Even flamethrowers failed to reach their mark. Soldiers began to whisper that the caves were alive, that the fire went in, but never came back out. One officer wrote home, "You can burn a house, you can flatten a city, but you can't kill an island that's decided it wants you dead." For the men trapped inside those tunnels, life was a whisper between earthquakes. Food ran low, air turned to poison. Yet the defenders held their posts, praying not for survival but for time. They believed each day they endured was another day Japan lived. For the Americans above, the lesson was growing clear. They weren't fighting soldiers anymore. They were fighting the anatomy of war itself. And somewhere deep in that stone labyrinth, the island was waiting for them to make the next move. The first real push into Okinawa's interior began like every other campaign: maps, artillery schedules, and confidence. But within hours, the rhythm broke. The terrain twisted into steep ridges, jagged coral spines, and valleys so narrow they felt like traps. The Marines advanced slowly, thinking they were closing in on a hidden line of defense. What they didn't realize was that the defense wasn't hidden. It was the island. Every ridge was wired with machine guns, every slope mined, every patch of grass watched by unseen eyes. When the Japanese fired, they didn't shout or charge. They simply let the earth open its mouth and swallow the living. By the end of the first week, the battlefield had turned into something unrecognizable. Hills changed hands a dozen times, only to reveal more tunnels underneath. Men fought ghosts, enemies who vanished into smoke, then reappeared from the same crater minutes later. "We're fighting the ground itself," one corporal wrote in disbelief. "Even the rocks shoot back." Flamethrowers turned the caves into glowing throats, but the fire never seemed to reach deep enough. When the flames died, new gunfire always came from the ashes. Okinawa was bleeding light, and every soldier who stepped forward found himself sinking into a place where even victory felt like punishment. The heat was unbearable. The smell, worse. Burning limestone mixed with oil, flesh, and sea wind until the air itself became heavy with dread. Nights were worse than days. The silence was never real. It hummed with distant gunfire, whispered voices, and the slow metallic groan of tanks clawing their way up ridges that seemed to reject them. Officers stopped giving orders. They just pointed. There was nowhere to retreat to, only forward, into more stone, more death, more of the same haunting question. How do you fight something that doesn't die the same way you do? Somewhere beneath those shattered cliffs, General Ushijima's plan was unfolding perfectly. He wasn't fighting for land, he was fighting for time. Each fallen soldier, each burned-out tank, each mile paid in blood brought America closer to exhaustion. The island was doing exactly what he'd designed it to do: break the enemy's will. Above ground, the Marines began to realize that brute strength would never win this war. To beat Okinawa, they'd have to think differently. They'd have to learn to fight like the island itself, patient, precise, and merciless. By mid-April, the American advance had stalled. Every ridge, every hollow, every patch of shattered coral came at a price too high to measure in territory. General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr. stood in his command tent, staring at maps that no longer made sense. Lines crossed out, arrows bleeding into nothing. His artillery had flattened hills, burned forests, and pounded the Shuri Line for days, yet the island seemed to rebuild itself overnight. The enemy wasn't retreating. It was absorbing the blows like stone drinking rain. Ushijima's plan had no interest in victory, only in numbers. He was solving an equation in blood, and the Americans were part of his formula. Inside the tunnels, the Japanese soldiers followed orders written in inevitability. They weren't told to hold positions. They were told to die efficiently. Every man, every bunker, every bullet had a purpose. If one machine gun fell silent, another took its place. They fought with a kind of mathematical patience, trading flesh for time, breath for attrition. "We are not trying to win," Ushijima told his officers. "We are trying to make them understand the cost." Above them, the U.S. artillery thundered day and night, but even victory began to sound like failure. Shells hit targets, yet the same guns kept firing from the same hills. Nothing seemed to stay dead. For the Americans on the ground, hope narrowed to survival. Units that landed 1,000 strong were reduced to a few hundred in days. They no longer fought for ground, but for minutes. Just a few more before the next barrage, the next scream. They began to measure time differently. A soldier could tell you how far he'd advanced, not in yards, but in bodies. "Every ridge costs 100 men," one captain wrote, "and the ridges never end." The island had turned war into arithmetic, precise, relentless, and cold. The numbers didn't lie, and they didn't care who added them up. Buckner knew something had to change. Brute force wasn't working. The maps, the guns, the doctrine, all of it had reached its limit. Okinawa had exposed a truth no one wanted to face. Courage alone couldn't win anymore. It had to be replaced by calculation. Somewhere offshore, aboard a Navy vessel, a crate was being opened. Inside it, a new kind of weapon, one that didn't rely on muscle or bravery. It relied on thought. Soon, the battlefield would evolve. The fire itself would begin to think. The first crates arrived under a veil of secrecy, dull green boxes marked only with serial numbers and silence. Inside them lay something strange, something no one on Okinawa had seen before, the proximity fuse. To most soldiers, it looked like just another piece of metal, but inside that metal was something new, a brain. Tiny circuits, a pulse of radar, a spark that could sense distance and react on its own. For centuries, artillery had been blind. Shells either hit the ground or missed entirely. But these fuses could see. They didn't wait to strike. They listened for their prey. The engineers called it variable time. The soldiers called it magic. It was born from desperation. American gunners had watched their shells bury themselves uselessly into Okinawa's limestone skin. Every blast looked spectacular, but the tunnels underneath stayed untouched. The VT fuse promised to change that. It didn't explode upon impact. It detonated in the air at the perfect height, showering the battlefield with steel rain. When the first barrage screamed across the sky and detonated 30 feet above the ridges, the effect was terrifying. Japanese soldiers looked up in confusion, expecting the usual impact. But the explosions bloomed above them, invisible and inescapable. The air itself had turned predator. Word spread quickly through the ranks. Marines whispered about the angel shells, bombs that seemed to know where life was hiding. For the first time, artillery wasn't just power. It was intelligence. It could think, react, decide. The gun crews began to treat their weapons differently, almost reverently. Some spoke to them before firing as if the machines could understand. "Go find them," one sergeant muttered before pulling the lanyard. When the shells burst, they didn't just break the enemy's defenses, they broke his faith. The sky, once the last refuge, had become judgment. Ushijima's soldiers realized too late that even the air had turned against them. But there was a dark beauty in this new precision. The more efficient the killing became, the less human it felt. The explosions no longer marked victory, they marked evolution. The battlefield had learned to think faster than the men fighting on it. Each new fuse, each adjustment of range, each flash in the clouds was another step toward a kind of warfare that needed no courage, only coordination. Fire had become intelligent, and with it came a question no general could answer. Once fire learns to think, who teaches it mercy? When the artillery learned to think, the next evolution arrived on treads. The Marines called them flame tanks. The Japanese called them Keian Sensha, fire tanks. Officially, they were M4 Shermans modified with a weapon no one could truly control. A flamethrower cannon capable of vomiting streams of napalm over 100 yards. The men who operated them swore they could feel the thing breathing inside. The fuel sloshing, the hiss of pressure building like a living heartbeat. When the nozzle ignited, it didn't roar like a gun. It hissed long and low, the sound of something alive and hungry. The first time they fired, the flame crawled out across the battlefield like liquid light, wrapping itself around caves and bunkers until the world itself began to scream. To the Japanese defenders hidden in the limestone tunnels, it was the closest thing to apocalypse. Fire didn't just burn, it sought. It followed oxygen, slipped through cracks, found vents and gun ports, then devoured everything within. One survivor later wrote, "The fire came for us even when we hid. It wanted to know our faces. There was no counterattack, no escape. Concrete that had survived thousands of shells began to melt from within. The fire didn't explode, it lingered, it breathed, it fed. Bunkers became ovens. Caverns glowed like open furnaces, and in the silence that followed, even the air seemed to die. The men inside those tanks weren't spared from horror either. Operating a flame tank wasn't glory. It was terror, sealed in steel. A single hit could ignite 290 gallons of napalm stored within. When a Sherman died, it didn't explode. It burst. Survivors said it looked like the sun falling to the ground. Yet they climbed back into their machines, day after day, because they knew this was the only weapon that could fight the island on its own terms. The artillery could break stone, but only fire could erase it. As the campaign dragged on, the flame tanks stopped being just machines. They became symbols of fear, of power, of something ancient and unstoppable rising inside modern war. Crews began to name them. Lucifer, the Reaper, Satan's chariot. Their painted mouths grinned through smoke and soot, teeth bared in mockery of the inferno they carried. And when the sun set behind Okinawa's cliffs, you could still see them burning. Small orange hearts moving through the darkness, whispering to the world that humanity had finally built something that burned exactly the way it dreamed. By May 1945, the battlefield had transformed into something unrecognizable. A fusion of smoke, thunder, and invention. The Americans no longer fought with mere weapons. They fought with systems. Artillery guided flame, flame exposed stone, and stone revealed the next target. The coordination was almost musical, explosions rising and falling in rhythm like a dark symphony echoing across the ridges. "We don't fight battles anymore," one lieutenant murmured. "We conduct them." And leading the orchestra were the flame tanks, the dragons of Okinawa. They advanced in pairs, their treads grinding over blackened coral, nozzles flickering like tongues of judgment. To watch them move was to see war evolve in real time. At places like Kakazu Ridge and Sugarloaf Hill, the dragons went to work. Artillery softened the defenses first, detonating with proximity fuses that rained steel from above. Then, when the echoes faded, the Shermans rolled forward, breathing fire into the wounds the shells had opened. Napalm streamed like molten rivers, pouring into vents and cracks. The hills began to glow from within. "The mountains screamed," one Marine said, "and then it was quiet." When the smoke cleared, there was no enemy left. Only the hiss of cooling rock and the sound of air returning to lungs that didn't want to breathe it. Yet even victory carried a curse. The men inside those tanks knew how fragile they were. A single shell, a stray grenade, even a lucky bullet could ignite their cargo and turn them into living pyres. They watched fellow crews vanish in blinding flashes, steel peeling back like paper, flames swallowing men whole before they could even open the hatch. They called it the Dragon's Curse, and still they advanced. Because on Okinawa, there was no other language left to speak. Fire had become logic. The island demanded it, and every hill that fell proved the terrible truth that the more precise war became, the less human it felt. By late May, the Shuri Line began to disintegrate. The once impenetrable fortress that had devoured entire divisions simply collapsed, not from surrender, but from erosion. Fire had eaten its heart. The ridges that once spat bullets now smoldered like the lungs of a dying beast. The dragons had done their work, but at a cost no one dared calculate. Looking out over the burning valleys, General Buckner said nothing. He didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He just watched the horizon shimmer with heat and whispered, "The stone finally screamed." And somewhere beneath that glow, the island's silence agreed. When the Shuri Line finally broke, it didn't crumble like a wall. It collapsed like a living thing that had run out of breath. For weeks, the island had absorbed every shell, every flame, every scream, and somehow endured. But now the ground itself began to give up. Hills that once spat fire turned to ash. Tunnels caved in. Caves that had swallowed men whole now exhaled only smoke. From the air, pilots could see what no one on the ground could grasp. The fortress wasn't being defeated. It was disappearing. Entire sections of Okinawa had simply melted out of existence, erased by a new kind of warfare that no longer just destroyed. It redefined what destruction meant. On the ridges, American soldiers walked through landscapes that felt biblical. Rock glowing faintly red, the smell of scorched limestone and fuel hanging like a fog. There was no cheering, no sense of triumph, just silence. "We didn't conquer it," one Marine said softly. "It just stopped fighting." The closer they moved to Shuri Castle, Ushijima's final command post, the stranger it became. The castle's ancient walls, once symbols of endurance, now stood blackened and hollow. Inside, the air shimmered with heat. In the distance, the artillery still thundered, though there was nothing left to hit. The island had gone quiet, but the fire refused to die. For the Japanese soldiers still alive beneath the rubble, the end came not with orders, but with inevitability. Ammunition gone, food gone, water turned to poison. Yet they stayed. Ushijima knew the war was lost, but he refused to surrender. He had built a fortress designed to bleed the enemy dry, and in that mission he had succeeded. On June 22, 1945, surrounded by the ruins of Shuri Castle, he performed seppuku alongside his chief of staff. Their final act was not defiance, but acknowledgement that the empire had burned through everything it had, even its humanity. When their bodies were found, the war in Okinawa was over. The lesson it left behind was only beginning. That night, the horizon glowed red from 100 smoldering hills. The sea reflected it back like a mirror of hell, waves tinted with ash and flame. The men who survived didn't cheer. They just watched. They had won, yes, but what exactly had they created? Fire that thought. Weapons that obeyed no mercy. A doctrine built on precision instead of courage. The island was silent. But the silence spoke clearly. Something irreversible had happened here. as one exhausted gunner murmured, loading his last shell before dawn. "We didn't just break their line, we broke the world." When the guns finally fell silent, Okinawa didn't feel like victory. It felt like aftermath. The air was thick, the sky gray with ash, and the earth itself reeked of iron and sorrow. The island had become a wound that refused to close. Corpses lay buried beneath melted rock, and twisted tanks cooled under the relentless sun. For 78 days, men had fought, burned, and bled until there was nothing left to destroy. Over 100,000 Japanese soldiers were gone, and 26,000 Americans were dead or wounded. The numbers filled official reports, but on the ground they were just names erased by fire. One Marine wrote home, "We didn't take the island. We erased it." Those who survived carried the war inside them. The flame tank crews, the artillerymen, the engineers, they all heard it at night. The hiss of napalm, the hum of shells that thought. Some said they could still smell the smoke in their clothes months later, even after leaving the Pacific. Fire had followed them, not in the sky, but in memory. "You can't burn it out of your mind," said Corporal Thomas Carlson, who had operated a flame tank. "Sometimes I still hear them screaming." They had seen men turn to light, and that sight, that impossible fusion of brilliance and horror, never left them. Back home, parades were held, medals awarded, speeches given about courage and sacrifice. But for those who had walked through the fire, the applause felt hollow. They had seen what modern war really meant, a war of precision, not passion. Machines had learned to kill more perfectly than men ever could. And the more efficient the killing became, the less meaning victory seemed to have. Many of the veterans stopped talking about Okinawa altogether. They knew that no photograph, no headline, could explain how it felt to watch a hill burn from the inside or to see a fortress breathe its last sigh. Even the survivors who returned to Okinawa years later said the island never stopped smoldering. Farmers plowed up bones. Children found rusted helmets and half-melted dog tags in their gardens. The caves were sealed, but locals whispered that at night you could still hear voices, faint, echoing, like the island remembering what it had endured. The fire hadn't stayed behind in 1945. It had followed everyone who touched it. It lingered in their lungs, their dreams, their silence. Because some wars don't end when the fighting stops. They end when the fire finally decides to sleep. In the shadow of Okinawa's burning hills, the world quietly changed. Generals in Washington studied the battle reports with grim fascination. They saw the numbers, 100,000 Japanese dead, tens of thousands of Americans gone, and understood what it meant. If this was the cost of one island, what would the invasion of Japan itself demand? Okinawa had proven that courage alone could not end a war, and that technology, once unleashed, could not be called back. The proximity fuse, the flamethrower tank, the doctrine of fire and precision, they were no longer tactics. They were prophecy. And somewhere in the deserts of New Mexico, a new kind of fire was already waiting to be born. When the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, many of the men who'd survived Okinawa were still recovering in hospital beds. They read the headlines in silence. Some wept. Others simply stared. They had already seen a smaller version of that apocalypse. The light, the heat, the vanishing of everything human in a single breath. For them, the mushroom cloud wasn't a beginning. It was an echo. The fire that had learned to think on Okinawa had now learned to split the sky. The war ended, but peace arrived wearing the same face as annihilation. In the decades that followed, veterans returned to the island that had tried to consume them. They found fields where ridges once stood and schools built over bunkers that still whispered beneath the ground. Some placed flowers on the rusted hulks of their old flame tanks. Others just stood in silence, touching the scorched metal like it was something sacred. "She's still warm," one of them said softly, brushing his hand across the steel. The fire that had raged there, that had screamed and hunted and thought, had never really gone out. It had just gone quiet, waiting for the next time humanity forgot what it could do. Okinawa was the last great battle of the Second World War, and the first of the modern age. It was the place where courage died and technology was born, where honor was replaced by efficiency, and war became less about bravery than about calculation. The island remains a warning, written in stone and smoke, that the line between survival and extinction is measured not in strength, but in memory. Because once fire learns to think, and man forgets who lit it, history stops being a story of battles and starts being a story of endings.